Huge, an enormous thank you. It's being recorded. Got it. Enormous thank you to Ekin, Kurtiç, a postdoc in the Cayman program for Turkish Studies, and Mariam Taher, a PhD candidate in anthropology, for organizing this event. They came to MENA in the fall, giving attention to current ecological and recent ecological disasters in the region that have gotten probably too little attention. So huge thanks to the two of you for conceptualizing this event, for wanting to put it on the calendar, for doing so much hard work to find a fantastic panel of people to speak, and for really encouraging all of us in Middle Eastern studies to give due attention to the intersection between MENA studies and environmental studies. So hats off and thank you to both of you. And as a part of that enormous work they did to put together this panel, and in the spirit of our theme of disasters and unpredicted crises, unfortunately, just about half an hour ago, we got word from one of our participants, Hamza Hamouchen. He's on the way to the hospital with his wife, so unfortunately cannot be here today to talk about Libya. We are sorry about that, but disasters and catastrophes and health emergencies happen. He reminds us, which I guess is a lesson in and of itself. So given that, we want to have a special time for Q&A and participation, and especially if any in the audience are passionate or knowledgeable about Lydia, they can help us make sure it gets its due attention in the course of this conversation. So with that, then I will pass the floor on to Ekin to introduce our event, and the rest of the panel will take it from there. Thanks.
Thank you, Wendy. And I would like to start by expressing my gratitude to Northwestern MENA program for granting us the opportunity to discuss the recent disasters in Morocco and Libya, although we are missing Hamza's speaking on Libya, but we have a panel of esteemed scholars and researchers to discuss ecological disasters in MENA today. So over the next hour and a half, our broader aim is to contribute to perspectives that denaturalizes what is framed as natural disasters by emphasizing the inseparable connection between the ecological, the political, economic, and the social. And while it feels challenging to express excitement or delight about this conversation, given that our subject matter revolves around issues of destruction and ruination with profound lived implications on the ground, as co-organizers, we are genuinely appreciative of this space for reflection, conversation, and collective thought. And we would like to thank you all for joining us today, especially our speakers. In recent months, especially in the last 4 months, ruins, rubble, and ruination have once again come to the forefront of events unfolding in the MENA region. And it is impossible to discuss these issues without acknowledging, recognizing what has been taking place in Gaza, Palestine, the genocidal violence razing everything that constitutes life to the ground. We want to note that when we designed this roundtable conversation back in September, focusing on the earthquake in Morocco and on the floods in Libya, so we designed it back in September, but we hope that this panel on disasters and catastrophes in North Africa will provide broader insights and perspectives applicable to reflecting critically on other contexts and forms of ruination. Also, lastly, before I turn it over to Mariam to introduce our speakers and give us an outline of the event structure, I want to emphasize that tomorrow, February 6th, marks the first anniversary of the devastating earthquakes in Turkey, Kurdistan, and Syria. And as the prompt of this roundtable emphasizes, disasters are not events. They are complex processes shaped by historically sedimented power differentials and existing structural inequalities, and they unfold with unevenly distributed impacts. The ongoing situation in the earthquake-affected regions of Turkey, unfortunately, illustrates this point very well. And for those of you interested to learn more and think further about the February 6th earthquakes in Turkey, I will provide links in the chat to a teach-in organized last year at Northwestern Cayman Modern Turkish Studies program, and along with a documentary of a recent events unfolding after the disaster in one of the most devastated cities in Turkey. So now let us focus more closely on how critical studies, critical disaster studies and political ecology perspectives can help us better understand and reflect on the events that unfolded in Morocco since September 2023. And I would this turn it over to Mariam.
Thank you, Ekin and Wendy and Margaret, and thank you to our speakers and our audience. We are very fortunate to have 2 rather than 3 speakers with us today who can each discuss these issues from differently specialized domains, and it is my pleasure to introduce them. Lydia Barnett is a historian of early modern Europe, focused on Italy, Britain, and the Atlantic world, and with thematic interests in science, religion, gender, and the environment. Her first book, After the Flood, Imagining the Global Environment in Early Modern Europe, illuminates the hidden role of religion and its complicated legacy in the emergence of a global environmental consciousness. From the late Renaissance through the early Enlightenment, and coincident with the Scientific Revolution and the Little Ice Age, Protestant and Catholic writers from across Europe and its American colonies drew on biblical story of Noah's flood as they imagined the human capacity to destroy nature on a planetary scale, as well as human suffering from the environmental consequences of their own actions. She is currently working on a second book project on invisible labor and gender in the 18th century earth and environmental sciences. Her research has been supported by the National Science Foundation, the Charlotte Newcomb Foundation, the Gladys Kriebel-Delmas Foundation, and the Michigan Society of Fellows. Brahim El-Guabli is a Black and Amazigh indigenous scholar from Morocco. He is also an associate professor of Arabic studies and comparative literature at Williams College. His first book, Moroccan Other Archives, History and Citizenship After State Violence, was published in 2023. His forthcoming book is titled Desert Imaginations, Saharanism and Its Discontents. His journal articles have appeared in PMLA, Interventions, the Cambridge Journal of Postcolonial Literary Inquiry, Arab Studies Journal, META, the Journal of North African Studies, and others. He is co-editor of the 2 volumes of Lem Aleph, a critical anthology of societal debates in Morocco during the years of lead, 1966 to 1988, and Refiguring Loss, Jews in the Maghrebi and Middle Eastern Cultural Production. El-Guabli is also co-founder and co-editor of the Tamazgha Studies Journal, as well as the Amazigh Studies series. Now, as we've noted, Hamza Hamouchine is sadly not able to join us today, but I will tell you briefly about him anyway, and I highly recommend looking him up. He's published widely on these issues. Hamza Hamouchine is a London-based Algerian researcher, activist, commentator, and founding member of Algeria Solidarity Campaign, Environmental Justice North Africa, and the North African Food Sovereignty Network, SIEDA. He is currently the Arab Region Program Coordinator at the Transnational Institute. His work focuses on issues of extractivism, resources, land and food sovereignty, as well as climate, environmental, and energy justice in the Arab region. He has authored and edited a number of works, including Dismantling Green Colonialism, Energy and Climate Justice in the Arab Region, The Struggle for Energy, Democracy in the Maghreb, The Coming Revolution to North Africa, The Struggle for Climate Justice, and others. He has also contributed widely, among others, to the Oxford Handbook of Economic Imperialism, the Routledge Essential Guide to Critical Development Studies, and Fanon Today, Reason and Revolt of the Wretched of the Earth. We will transition now to commentary from our speakers. With each of you, Lydia and Brahim, perhaps speaking for about 8 minutes. This will be followed by 1 question from me, with maybe a 5 or so minute response from each of you and a question from Ekin with responses. And after that, we will open up the questions from the audience. You are welcome to type up your questions in the chat at any time in the audience. You can also wait and raise your hand and pose your question yourself when we get to the Q&A section. And we will proceed in the order of introductions. So perhaps Lydia can go ahead, to be followed by Brahim. Thank you.
Sure. Thank you, Mariam, for that lovely introduction. And I just want to begin today by thanking Ekin and Mariam for organizing this event, and also to Wendy and to the MENA program. I'm really so excited to be included in this conversation, especially since, as you all heard from Mariam's introduction, I'm not at all an expert on the region, but what they have asked me to do is to kind of set the stage for our conversation by giving a kind of general introduction to the field of disaster studies, which I'm very happy to do, and put that on the table. So I'll just use my time to quickly highlight a few of the key principles and core critical concepts in the interdisciplinary field of disaster studies as it's emerged really over the last 3 decades. And highlight a couple of case studies that I'm more familiar with of floods and earthquakes elsewhere in the world and farther back in history. And then I'll really look forward to hearing from my co-panelists and from others in the audience who are more expert in the region and than I am about kind of how and whether you see some of these principles and core concepts working or maybe not working in Libya and Morocco in these recent disaster events. So probably the key takeaway, I would say, from the field of disaster studies, as I mentioned, which is a relatively recent field, is that natural disasters are never natural. They're always at least partly man-made. And that's not to deny that geophysical forces are involved, certainly, but what makes those sharp and sudden movements of wind, air, earth, water, seismic activity, what makes those into disasters is ultimately human choices, human agency, and human history. And I think one of the clearest examples of this principle that natural disasters are never natural is the pair of earthquakes that struck Latin America in 2010. First in Haiti in January, and then the next month in Chile in February. The earthquake in Haiti struck near the capital city of Port-au-Prince. It was quite a large earthquake. It was a 7.0 magnitude on the Richter scale, so that's a really big one. It had an astonishingly high death toll. The estimates are between 150 and 300,000 people who lost their lives in that earthquake, with a further 1 million people displaced. By contrast, the earthquake in Chile just 6 weeks later, which also struck near the capital, Santiago, but a bit south in Concepcion. It was actually a much, much larger earthquake by several orders of magnitude. It was an 8.8 magnitude on the Richter scale. And yet, fewer than 600 people lost their lives in that second earthquake. That was 2 orders of magnitude stronger. So how is it possible that the much weaker earthquake killed far, far more people? The kind of the immediate cause of that huge difference in mortality was that the buildings in Chile were mostly up to code, and the ones in Haiti were not. And again, that kind of immediate reason is a factor behind that, of course, is Chile's relative wealth and state capacity. But, as a historian, I would say that, that difference in turn has to be seen in light of the much longer history of the freedom struggles of both of those two countries and their very different paths to national independence at the turn of the 19th century, in which Haiti was essentially forced to purchase its freedom as a country from France, something no other country in the Western Hemisphere was made to do. And, historians feel that it's not a coincidence that Haiti was also the only country in the Western Hemisphere whose revolution of independence was led by people of African descent, who understood themselves to be fighting a war of emancipation, a war of the abolition of slavery, as well as a revolution towards freedom from overseas imperial rule. And it took Haiti until 1947 to repay that debt to France, 150 years, which left Haiti deeply impoverished and thus without the resources in 2010 to adequately prepare for known threats. So I think that tale of two earthquakes is just a really clear illustration of the way that there's no direct correlation between the geophysical forces at work and on the one hand and the human suffering on the other. And so I think it's examples like this, of which there are many, that is the reason why it's become, I think, kind of a truism or a commonplace in disaster studies to say there's no such thing as a natural disaster. You see that repeated over and over again. And I think then I would highlight a kind of second core principle of the field that's maybe a corollary of the first, which is that natural disasters disproportionately harm those who are already marginalized, those who are already socially vulnerable or in positions of precarity before the disaster has even struck. So time and again, the people who suffer the greatest harm during and after disaster events are those who are already marginalized by race, class, gender, age, sexuality, disability, religion, country of origin, or whatever other category of difference or system of oppression is most salient in the place where the disaster strikes. And so, here we might think, I think Americans will naturally think of Hurricane Katrina in 2005, where those who were most vulnerable to the effects of that hurricane and subsequent flooding were those who were without the means to evacuate the city, who were too poor to afford cars, and thus couldn't comply with the mandatory evacuation orders that were issued ahead of the storm. As well as those who were living in low-lying neighborhoods that were close to the levees, which failed, and those whose neighborhoods within the urban topography of the city were kind of flooded first and hardest. And of course, those people were overwhelmingly poor and overwhelmingly Black. And there's a geography of inequality there in the city, depending on who lives in high ground and who lives in low-lying ground and who lives closer to the levees and to the river which flooded, that also go back to the 18th century and to New Orleans settlement as a slaving port city in the 18th century that led to that geography of racial inequality as it existed in 2005 when the hurricane started. So there's just, another really clear example of the way that historical processes sediment and those harms kind of accelerate over time. So this phenomenon of the uneven distribution of harms is often referred to as social vulnerability or differentiated vulnerability. And it's such a pervasive feature of disaster events that, even though there's often a kind of rhetoric in the wake of disaster events of kind of we're all in this together, it is true that rescue efforts, the rebuilding, the memory making can and often do bring people together across lines that usually do divide them in everyday life. But it's simply not true that disasters affect everybody equally, which is why a kind of second core principle in the field is that disasters expose and often exacerbate pre-existing social inequalities. And that's another way in which natural disasters are never natural. So I'll just make one final point, which is to say that this recognition of the unnaturalness of natural disasters means that the kind of key critical move in disaster studies is to denaturalize, which I think Ekin mentioned in her opening comments, to illuminate those inequalities and historical injustices and power structures that are behind the differentiated harms that we see in disaster events. And so it's very common in the wake of a disaster event for politicians and other state actors to say publicly, this is, wow, like Mother Nature really, did some amazing work here that nobody could have predicted, nobody could have seen coming. This was a perfect storm, what a terrible tragedy. And, those statements are ultimately self-serving and serve to invisibilize the actual social injustices that are behind the catastrophe to begin with. And so that's kind of part of the, I think, reason for critical disaster studies sometimes is to do that critical work of denaturalizing a disaster event that has been naturalized by politicians or by the media. Though I should say that, to give credit where credit is due, a lot of the times it's actually the survivors of disaster events themselves, the ones who are most profoundly and negatively impacted, who are the ones who often stand up to kind of speak truth to power and do that critical analytical work of denaturalizing. So I think the title of the roundtable today of uneven and sedimented disasters is really very apt. And I think it really speaks to these core truths that are really central to critical disaster studies, that the harms of disasters are unequally distributed, both across communities and around the world. And that those unequal impacts are often the result of long durational historical processes. And so with that, I will turn it over to my esteemed co-panelist, and I'm really looking forward to the conversation.
Thank you, Lydia. Thank you, Ekin and Mariam and Wendy for the invitation. It's a real pleasure to hear you talk, Lydia, and kind of like you gave a wonderful background from theory to what I'm going to say. And I was going to start by saying that disaster is human, meaning that humans create disaster and that disasters happen in human life, but it all depends on how we respond to it and how we learn from it. I think for me, with so much that has happened in the last few months, Morocco kind of like receded back into my memory, and just like thinking about disaster, I was going to say like we have to distinguish between man-made and natural disasters, but there is really no clear-cut distinction because, as we know now from environmental studies and climate studies, that climate change is an important factor in instigating, spurring, and creating disaster. So we're in a loop that Lydia has nicely explained. That we should not exculpate man and humanity and people from disaster. Specifically about Morocco, on September 8, a 6.8 magnitude earthquake hit a very important part of Morocco. I'm going to share this picture just for the people who don't know. And its epicenter was in the High Atlas Mountains. For the people who know the history of Morocco, the Atlas Mountains really separate the country into two halves. There is the northern half and the southern half. And if you look at the mountain and see how the rain works, when humid air comes and hits the mountain, it goes back and it rains all over this area. Whereas the other side, the eastern or the southern side of the mountain, is desert, or it's mountainous. It's mainly like dry or arid lands with some oases and some fields, and this in itself created an imaginary from the colonial time, or even from the pre-colonial time, that this part of Morocco was useful and this other part was useless. So we're already creating a distinction between two different parts, one that is useless for extractive reasons and the other one was useful for extractive reasons and the other one was not as useful. But then all of that is overlaid by an imaginary of this part being under the control of the authorities and this other part being Bilad Siba, or the land of discord, of anarchy, or of rejection of authority. And of course, colonialism built on these distinctions to kind of like emphasize its authority. And what follows later is really interesting because it shaped the way money, funds, development is allocated throughout Morocco, where you have cities that are on European standards, and then you have areas that barely have any infrastructure. So when this earthquake hit Morocco, it led to the death of about 2,900 people, thousands of injured, demolished over either partially or totally about 59,000 houses, and left a lot of people without any livelihood because the sources of their income were destroyed by the earthquake. Several elements come up when a disaster happens. First of all, the response to the disaster. What happens? What did the authorities do? How did they manage the disaster? So the Moroccan case really is very interesting because you can see the imbrication of diplomacy, transnational conflicts, and also the international dimension of the response. One of the first things the Moroccan authorities did, which was very controversial to many people, was that they refused aid from several countries, France, Algeria, and some other countries, with which they had a very tense relationship up to that point. And the disaster became a moment for the assertion of sovereignty and the state responding to people who at some point opposed its own agenda or its own vision of some questions. And this elicited a lot of attention. However, there is also the dimension of how did the state respond internally to the victims of the earthquake and the survivors. There was a lot of delay in some areas, but there was also a lot of efficiency in others. If you look at the meetings that happened at the state level, there was a lot of efficiency, I think, in many ways, because the army was deployed. And if you know how power works in Morocco, nobody can move the army from one place to another except the king. So there were very clear instructions for the army to move forward. Like within hours, the army was deployed into these areas. Was that efficient? Was it not? These are other questions that come up. But I think the fact that the state made that decision was very important because it also gave people a sense of security and that the state is there. But over the days, there was, I think, a more coordinated effort to actually alleviate the impact of the earthquake by providing food, shelter, tents, and also try to find a lot of the people who were still missing or under the debris of the demolished houses. However, none of that is enough because you still have some areas where people were stuck for days and where, as Lydia was saying, survivors themselves actually became the agents who were digging people up, burying people, rescuing their relatives and all of that. So I think we always have to think about the multi-pronged way in which a state responds to a disaster. And also to think over time, like what happens immediately, what happens in the intermediate period, and then what happens on the long term. I think these are really important things because a state might respond efficiently immediately, but then on the long term, you forget about people and they will come back to this. And what the disaster in Morocco uncovered is really important to also highlight. It uncovered inequity between highly developed places where there is an excellent infrastructure, highways, rapid trains, a really great building criteria and requirements, and the zone that was impacted by the earthquake, where all of that is absent, because the efficiency of the rescue mission could have been much better and much faster if this area was accessible, if the roads were paved, if the trucks could get through, if you could get food to the people quickly. These are all really important things to think about. It also uncovered histories of colonialism, what I was talking about, the binary between Bilad Siba and Bilad al-Makhzen, and the useful Morocco and the useless Morocco. And then it also revealed to the world, and I think for the first time for a lot of people, the cultural dimension of the earthquake in Morocco, which is like this is an overly Amazigh area. The majority of the population of the High Atlas in Morocco are Amazigh people who are like part of the larger indigenous population of North Africa. People for the first time probably discover Amazigh language, Amazigh culture, that there is actually something called Amazigh people in North Africa, and that they are part of a larger story of marginalization. And the earthquake brings that up and makes it, foregrounds it, and makes it part of the discussion about the disaster. Another thing that I think is really important to think about in the case of Morocco, particularly linked to the response. So we said that the response was swift in some ways. Some people were not happy with it. But now, like 4 months later, I've been reading that people were very unhappy with the way the authorities have handled the reconstruction, because reconstruction is really the main priority for people. Your house is demolished, you need to rebuild it. You lost your animals, you lost your livelihood, and you need to come back and gain a sense of normalcy, but you can't regain a sense of normalcy without having a home. And there had been some demonstrations by people, like protests. People have been very critical and vocal about the tardiness of the distribution of funds, because the state has decided to give people about $8,000 for partially demolished houses and $15,000 for entirely demolished. But in reality, the value of some homes exceeds that. So where are people supposed to get the difference? And also, I would like to say that the state decided to pay an amount of money to families, about $2,000 to $2,500 dollars for each family, for a monthly payment for about 2 years. And in some cases, again, the way the state proceeded. So how do you identify who deserves to receive reconstruction money, for example? How do you define who deserves to get aid? These are very messy questions because they are not straightforward after the disaster. Like I know for sure in my where I grew up in my village, that there are people who were overlooked. They just didn't even look at their property. Because of the way the committees that are put in place are made, they really don't heed the people. They don't think about people. They think about, they have their own criteria, and they just, I know that when they got to my house, to my father's house, which was kind of like partially demolished, the representative of the authorities just said, this is an abandoned home. And the committee just walked away. So that's that, it's done. But I mean, I don't need to get money from the state to rebuild my father's home. That's fine. But what about somebody else who does, who needs that money to rebuild their home? And there are several cases. So I'll just finish there, that it's not straightforward. It's very messy. And I think that the post-disaster is as important as the disaster itself.
Thank you, Brahim and Lydia. These are all very thoughtful and generative remarks. And my first question is, in fact, about the response. So maybe I can ask you both to elaborate on many of the themes you've laid out already. So specifically, I want to ask about the politics of natural disasters, or how, like we've discussed, we call them natural, but we know they're not at all devoid of politics. And we can trace this on different levels. So of course, right now, we know that the climate crisis is a leading driver in the increased frequency of so-called natural disasters. It's both a matter of political urgency, but it's also something that's very politically divisive, and managing a politics of sustainability is far from apolitical. But we also have different historical incidents and recent and ongoing occurrences where we can trace how disaster is politicized, but also its aftermath and its response and the so-called reconstruction phases. And so whether recently in Iraq, currently in Ukraine, and to the chagrin of many right now in Gaza, people are talking about the day after. People are already squabbling over the politics of reconstruction. This is sort of looming as a site of cynical political opportunism or exploitation. So my question is, what does post-disaster repair, or lack of it, tell us about political power in general, and more specifically, what have been the political dimensions, or what's the political landscape of reconstruction in Morocco so far? So we've had time to see the sort of immediate short-term response. Maybe we're moving into a medium range response now before we can look at a long-term response and assess. And maybe we'll go ahead again, first with Lydia and then with Brahim.
Sure. I mean, I could begin by just giving a kind of general, offering some general thoughts before turning it over to Brahim, who can speak more specifically to the Moroccan case, which is to just say everything I think that you brought up, Mariam, is really important to consider. I mean, the built environment is always an expression of power, though can also be a tool for justice and for transformation. So, you know, I think, again, speaking in general terms, any kind of event that destroys material infrastructure and the built environment always opens up the potentiality for retrenchment of power, for abuse, for power grabs. That's historically happened in many times and places. At the same time, again, I'm thinking of a lot of examples of colonial cities that were destroyed by earthquakes in the 18th century, where colonial officials, both on the ground and in the metropole in Europe, used an earthquake or another, often an earthquake, but sometimes other disaster events as an opportunity to rebuild cities in ways that served imperial interests. So, you know, I think that's both true that there's an opportunity for retrenchment of power, and at the same time that disasters, you know, can often be inflection points where there's a possibility of power being challenged or disrupted in the way that reconstruction and rebuilding happens. So yeah, those are just some very general thoughts, but I'd be really curious to hear Brahim speak about the specifics of the politics of repair and reconstruction.
Absolutely. Thank you. That's a great way to segue into it. I think one of the questions that has been kind of like asked over and over in Morocco is the place of the king in the reconstruction, particularly after 48 hours after the disaster. People were like, well, Morocco is a monarchy, an executive monarchy where the king really has a lot of power. So where is the king? What's he doing? How is he handling this? And why isn't he, for example, in the High Atlas with the people and all of that? Think what you want to think about it, but the way a monarchy functions in North Africa or in the Gulf is absolutely different from the way you would see a European monarchy. I'm not justifying this or anything. I'm just trying to draw people's attention to the fact that these are different systems and the way they respond are totally different. However, the way where politics really comes into it is that nobody else can do anything before the people who have power are seen on the ground. So in the United States or in Canada, for example, probably the mayor of a city would be the first one to show up in a disaster and like just kind of like calm down the people. Officials in a place like Morocco are told not to do that because they would take away from the higher officials who actually have the actual power. Even in terms of seeking donations and like channeling aid into these sinister areas, you really have to be careful to not go through these elected officials because the authorities would not like that, because the authorities think that these people would actually use the aid to become more important or to have a better reputation in the community, and then to be very easily re-electable and all of that. So the politics of aid it should be deeply linked to the question of democracy. What does aid look like or response to disaster look like under a semi-authoritarian regime? And what does it look like in a democracy where people are elected to represent the people and their response to the needs of the people during a disaster is part and partial of their responsibilities as elected officials. So what happens in a context like the Moroccan context? No, everybody has to be sidelined because the disaster is the province of the king. And the king is the one who manages disaster, who has the power and the means to manage disaster. So that kind of like in some ways explains some tardiness, some indecisiveness that people have noted, and also some sort of like smaller officials not being able to answer questions, like they cannot answer the press, they cannot engage in public discussions because they don't have the power to do so. And then just to add on Lydia's question about the identity of place, I think I absolutely agree with you that a disaster can entirely reconfigure the space and shift the identity of a space from what it was to something entirely different. And what's specific about this particular earthquake is that it hit an entirely Amazigh area that has its very specific architectural and environmental identity that is imbricated into what it is. So the transformation of the place means the linguistic, a very strong linguistic shift in the identity of the High Atlas Mountains and the southern part of the High Atlas Mountains. And one of the questions that came up is, so how is the state going to rebuild these homes? Are they going to keep the same architectural style? Are they going to create town centers where small villages are going to be brought together to form a center? What's the cost of that approach? what is it going to do to the demographic makeup of the high Atlas, then is that really a sustainable solution? Because that person who lives at the top, the summit of the mountain, lives there because he or she has some trees. They are shepherds. Their way of life links them to that place. So if you shift where they live, they can live anywhere because they no longer have the reasons that actually connect them to the place. So if you think about some argan trees, or you think about somebody having some nut trees or almond trees, or somebody sheep herding, that's a way of life that's linked to the place itself. And this has been a very long debate that like sociologists, anthropologists, and people who worked on the High Atlas have brought up. But luckily, I think the authorities in Morocco are very conscious about keeping the identity of the High Atlas as it had been, but through a new construction style that takes into consideration the fact that we know that it can witness very strong earthquakes. So I'm reading from a statement from the Prime Minister in which he said that about 30,000 reconstruction permissions have been issued from different counties in Morocco, and the authorities have put in place a system that would allow families to use blueprints that are created to take into consideration the characteristics of the region. So this is very good because we were very concerned about some plans and ideas that were floating in the months after the earthquake. But no, I think it's very clear that the authorities, because this also has a very important economic dimension for the state. Like if you transform the High Atlas Mountain, the tourism industry built around the architecture that was destroyed by the earthquake, the way of life, the trekking, the restaurants, the guest houses, all of that would probably vanish because it would not be as attractive for tourists. So it's also part of a national tourism industry, and I think there is a big interest in keeping these architectural and cultural characteristics intact, but in sturdier terms that would actually protect the inhabitants from future earthquakes, or at least from the destruction and devastation that would happen if another earthquake hits the region.
Thank you so much. These are such generatives and insightful remarks that I'm sure keeps all of us thinking more and more about the politics of reconstruction, not only through the lenses of the political regime, centralized, decentralized, authoritarian, democratic, but also through the cultural politics of reconstruction, which is equally both political, but it's also, as you very well said, spatial, environmental, and a very cultural topic. And so through that, I would like to also take us back to the question of materiality, maybe, in our next round of question and answering. Specifically because I wonder how we can continue thinking about material landscapes, material environments, together with the political, social, and cultural. Definitely disaster studies has already underlined, as Lydia very well also summarized, there is nothing there is no thing as natural disaster. And here, as Brahim very well showed, all these political, social and economic dimensions are very much involved in making the earthquake a disaster. So in that framework, I wonder how we can again go back to the question of the material, actually, maybe the materiality of the landscape, the mountainous area that you mentioned, or the materiality of the event itself, the disaster itself, being composed of, being led because of the fault lines underground, right? It's a subterranean process that has happened. So how can we think about all these material issues, how they impact how things are going to be unfolded in the aftermath of the disaster, and how can we take those into consideration without necessarily delinking them from the politics, but maybe still continue thinking about the agency of the material landscape without necessarily fetishizing it or essentializing it. So my question was a bit more comparative, asking you, I was going to ask you maybe to talk about what does it mean that it happened, an earthquake happened in Morocco, and then we are talking about the flood issue, very much a water issue in Libya. So maybe comparing those two materialities would make the discussion fruitful, but still you could, I guess, if you could reflect on the question of materiality, and it maybe did it also allow the political rulers to naturalize the earthquake and use it politically more easily because it's an earthquake. Those kinds of questions were in my mind, actually. And Lydia, after Brahim, if you want to also reflect on the more broader question of materiality in the scholarship of disaster studies, that would be perfect too. I think you're muted, Brahim.
Yeah, I think we can't escape the material aspect of the disasters. You talk about the dam in Libya, and you talk about the earthquake in Morocco. And so there is only 3 days between them, September 8th in Morocco and September 11th. And I remember actually like someone coming to me and said, what's happening to North Africa is all falling apart. These things, I think when we think about materiality, we can actually break it down into several aspects. So there is the visible, which is like the destruction. We talk about thousands of people killed, thousands of homes in Libya, even more so than in Morocco. So there is the material aspect of like losing material possessions, losing people. There is grief that can also turn into a material aspect because you're losing people who are supporting families, you're losing people who have jobs, you're losing your livelihood. There is also, I think, the material aspect of cracks, just thinking about cracks in a dam, and they would do. But I think beneath that crack in a dam, we can ask the question of where is the state differently between Morocco and Libya. Here we have two different processes that happened and led to the same result almost. But one of it can be called a natural disaster. It's an earthquake, so you don't really control when an earthquake happens. But as Lydia was saying, you can control or you can mitigate the impact of an earthquake. Like, so the mitigation of the material consequences of a disaster is actually part and parcel of the experience of disaster itself. I'll give you an example. Like in 2001, another earthquake hit the north of Morocco, and the same thing happened. Like hundreds of people died. It became a major national catastrophe. And what the state did in that whole area is impose reconstruction norms and construction norms that today have become the norm in the north. And ever since then, a few other earthquakes happened, but nobody died. So it's like you move from the materiality of destruction to the materiality of sturdiness, of construction norms, of scientific building, of homes, but that requires an understanding of the topography of where you're evolving, knowing first and foremost that this place is prone to be a place that will witness a disaster, particularly earthquakes. I think now with seismography or seismology, like we know much more about these areas. I think going back to, so in Morocco, like I think the hyper presence of the state and the hyper absence of the state. These are two elements that we can connect Libya and Morocco through. So Libya does not really have a functional state. Since the demise of Gaddafi, you have these factions, one in Tripoli and one in Benghazi, and you literally have two governments sharing and running the country. But then the question is, what could have happened? Was this outcome, or could have this outcome been avoided or spared the Libyans had there been a functional state? Because states also do have functions, they do have routines. And one of the routines is that you have employees who check the material, like they go to a dam and look, take measurements, look if there are any fissures, if there are any cracks and all of that. And my understanding from the Libyan case is that there was actually money that was earmarked for some sort of reparation in this dam, but it was not done because of the absence of the state. Like that's one. Then on the opposite, so here you have ignorance, you have the state not playing its role. On the Moroccan side, after the earthquake, what really happens is that you have a hyper-centralized state where everybody is waiting for the order to come from above in order to do what they're supposed to do. And these are totally different levels. But what they do have in common is that at the end, you could avoid some of the material damage that happened in the two places, or the late rescuing of some people, and so on and so forth. I hope this gets into the heart of your question. I don't know if it does.
It totally does. Thank you a lot. And Lydia, do you want to add anything on it?
Well, yeah, I mean, I'll just add to what Brahim said, which is that I think, it was really interesting to me to hear about, I think you said it was the 2001 earthquake in Morocco, which just, both in areas that are seismically active, as well as in areas that are flood prone, or that are prone to hurricanes or typhoons or whatever it is, that disasters tend to have a kind of iterative quality, which is precisely what makes them predictable, or at least, again, not in time, but in space. And is then, I think, precisely what then tends to feed into a lot of the political critique of state capacity and state actors for being caught flat-footed, because this is a seismically active region. There was an earthquake there 20 years ago, and so yeah, I think your point is really well taken, that the materiality matters, and and I'm very conscious of the way that my remarks today have mostly been happening on a very general level, even though as a historian I'm like deeply committed to the specificity of time and place and contingency in each of those places, and so that's why I'm really grateful to hear from experts in the region who can speak more specifically to the kind of unique both natural geography and political geography of these places that really do matter for the particular way that that people are impacted and the way that reconstruction and rebuilding happens. And maybe I'll just say, one more thing too, to hook up with something that Brahim said about the way that the kind of culturally distinctive and linguistically distinctive peoples of the High Atlas Mountains, who I would imagine, and I would be curious to hear you say this, that again, in general, indigenous peoples often, when they have land sovereignty, are better prepared for the disasters, the type of disasters that are endemic to the region where they live. And it's one of the many reasons for why land-back movements make sense in the era of rapidly accelerating disasters, in the era of global climate change. There are lots of, that's an instrumentalist reason, but it's just one of many, aside from the moral argument, that indigenous peoples, when they have sovereignty over their land and the ability to build buildings that can withstand earthquakes according to traditional techniques, for example, often have, because indigeneity is tied to a long-standing relationship to between a land and a people, and a kind of knowledge that comes from that long-standing relationship, then means that the way that disasters have this kind of iterative quality and have long repeating histories means that that indigenous people often have the longest memories, and thus the kind of best cultural repositories for just kind of being able to meet those challenges. I'm not sure if that's what you were asking for either. I feel like I'm kind of following a train of thought here that may or may not be useful, but I'd be really curious to hear from the audience at this point their thoughts on this question about materiality and some of the other things that have come up today.
Sure, definitely. Your points are very well taken and reflect the importance of the material questions as well. I just wanted to give Brahim a chance to, if you want to say something on Amazigh people being the indigenous people in the land and having a long-term, long-standing connection to land, and knowing the disasters that have already happened in that landscape, and having developed maybe their own architectures and their own infrastructures, if that was a point to take into consideration in Morocco, especially in disaster response. If you want to say anything on what Lydia has raised, and then we will open it up to question and answer. So I encourage everyone to write their questions in chat. You are muted.
That's a wonderful point to bring up, and this question of indigeneity is really important. And what's really interesting is to look at the buildings that withstood the earthquake. Like if you think, for example, about the Kasbah of Talwat, like this very big 19th century Kasbah, the Kasbah in my village, the Kasbah in the city of Warzat. These are all Kasbahs that were built at the end of the 19th century, early 20th century, and they withstood the earthquake. And they are like three stories. Like it's not like small buildings. These are really high buildings, high risers for the norms of the time, and they had very little damage. And I think that has a lot to do with the construction style, with the know-how and the technique that went into building sturdy buildings for very specific purposes, that is like authority, and some of the houses also like withstood the impact of the earthquake because they were well built. So there is definitely this element of an architectural style, a construction style that is suited to the region, to the materials that exist in the region, to the know-how that went into building these spaces. And another thing that I wanted to add here is that video, the inhabitants of some of these areas actually did say that they were aware that they needed to rebuild their homes, that they needed to change the way their homes were built, but the authorities were not giving them permissions to do so because of the preserved nature of the area. So there is this tacit understanding that this is a touristic region. It's very hard to get permissions to actually change or rebuild your home. So this is a very important question. But overall, I think that, yes, I agree with Lydia that the Amazigh style of building, particularly the houses that are well done, following the techniques of construction that are tested by time, have withstood the impact of the earthquake. Like stone buildings, for example, were not as impacted, whereas brick buildings fell apart, and that's very interesting to think about.
On this very important point, actually, we can open it up to audience questions, remarks, and we invite you to type in the chat, or you can also raise your hand if you want to speak up your question yourself. And I'm seeing currently a comment, not very much a question, but I'm going to read it. So it comes from Nur Allah, and from the beginning, I apologize if I mispronounce any of the names. Audience names. So the comment goes, in Libya, the issue is compounded, the neglect during the 40 years of authoritarian rule, a conflict, and then the flood. And I think this very well points to the issue of disasters being sedimented processes. So it is very much a comment or in agreement with the framework of this roundtable discussion, I guess. And I think Brahim's points about the case's difference from Morocco very well reflected that too. And I would add to that comment that on top of the conflict and then the flood, there was also, as also mentioned by Brahim, there was the question of infrastructure and failure of maintaining the infrastructure. So the flood also became a disaster because of the unmaintained dam and its collapse too. So it's very much compounded, really, and sedimented in that sense. Are there any other questions from the audience? I'm seeing a hand raised and sorry, Nick, you can just unmute yourself, I guess, and then.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for these great presentations. I was wondering if you could speak a little bit more about the kind of moment after disaster, the potential of state building. I think you mentioned like colonial powers, taking disaster as a time to redesign cities. And I was thinking about that, about both in terms of actual infrastructure, in terms of, rebuilding cities, but also in terms of national consciousness. And I think early in the talk, Chile was mentioned, and, a lot of the natural disasters, the responses by the state have been framed as, Chilean pride, when the miners were pulled out of the ground and when there was only 600 deaths in the earthquake. So I'm wondering about the kind of ways in which states capitalize on natural disasters in terms of state building, in both terms of infrastructure and national consciousness. But thank you all. This is great to hear into.
Maybe to speak to that really quickly, thanks for that question. Yeah, I mean, I think it certainly can happen and has happened that some state actors might find it convenient to kind of capitalize on a disaster as a form of consolidating power or inculcating a sense of national pride. And again, I mean, I see that as sometimes often very real and heroic efforts on the part of residents who are often left bereft of the resources that they need to truly survive and to recover, who are kind of making do and helping each other, pulling, I think, pulling friends and family out of the rubble, as I think Brahim alluded to. And then that can be, cynically capitalized on as a way of saying, oh, look how, we've all come together. And that, I think, can end up being another, especially in our present moment, kind of excuse for why a state doesn't need to pour more money or resources into reconstruction and rebuilding or preparedness for the next disaster that's bound to come, because it's like, look how everybody is kind of doing this on their own without state help. So not that that is what always happens, but I think that there's always that that potential.
Yeah, what I would say is that we should not divorce the way states respond from collective memory and from the way history is also kind of like is on the minds of political actors. In 1960, there was another earthquake, devastating earthquake in the city of Agadir in Morocco. And, you know, like if you can imagine, Morocco as a state had barely got its independence from France in 1956. And then you have this huge earthquake that destroys an entire city, and then Muhammad's fifth and his son and his family go there, and you know it becomes a really strong moment to federate a very divisive Morocco at that point in time around the monarchy and create this collective memory of cohesion and coherence despite the political disagreements at the time. And as a child growing up in Morocco, I've always heard about the earthquake of Agadir, and it has this like huge impact on the way Moroccans think about solidarity or being a country tied together through or connected through solidarity. At the same time, I think the earthquake becomes a moment for the state to glorify its own actions and instill this idea that it's efficient, that it has responded quickly, that it's doing all the right things, and it really cares about its citizens. And what states have that ordinary individuals don't have is the strong media and very present. And one of the failures of this strategy in Morocco was actually the lack of people who spoke Tamazight on the Moroccan television. So here you have like a 98, 99% area that was devastated by a very strong earthquake, and the Moroccan television was still addressing the people through the very old mechanisms of like a linguistic medium that most of the uneducated people didn't understand. So that was like one of the biggest failures of this earthquake. And even if the state wanted to communicate something, it did not really use the language that people wanted to that people spoke and heard. And also in terms of listening to people themselves. It was very interesting because I wrote an article in which I said, did people really hear the pain of Imaziren? In which I say, well, these people were traumatized. They were just hit by this very strong earthquake, and everybody brings a microphone and asks them to respond in a language they didn't understand. So how can you express your trauma and get it across without being able to convey it in your mother tongue? That was like one of the failures of this. It actually took the state a couple of weeks to then have people who speak Tamazight come on TV and address the population. So I think what I'm trying to say is that there are ways in which the state can use such a tragic moment to rebuild, as you said, national consciousness, but also there are very dangerous ways in which this fails, like when you don't have the basic element that is necessary to actually address the people who are afflicted.
Thank you. This is yet another very, very important layer which adds to the complexity of disasters and their aftermaths, that needs to be really taken care of in a very complex and multi-layered ways. Also considering the language of the people is a very, very important point. Any other questions and hands from the audience? if we have. I just want to give a moment, a chance.
I have a quick follow-up question for Brahim, if there are no other questions, or while we wait for people to collect their thoughts. I would be so curious to know, well, first of all, that there was this earthquake in the kind of immediate moment post-independence is so interesting to me. And I think you're right that, I mean, the politics of what gets remembered and whose perspective gets remembered, is just so deeply political. What disasters get remembered, which ones are forgotten. And I think I heard you mention maybe earlier in your remarks that you felt like this most recent 2023 earthquake had kind of receded a bit. But then when you were speaking just now, it made me wonder, like, how do you think that the 2023 earthquake will be remembered? And, you know, like, will the Emerzik perspective be part of that collective memory? Will it be sidelined? Like, what do you see happening with that collective memory making? Oh, I think you might be muted again, or still.
Sorry. Yeah, I think that post-independence moment was really important to solidify the image of the monarchy in the Moroccan psyche after independence. And the way the city of Agadir was rebuilt and what it became was definitely, or is definitely, attributable to that disaster. So if you go to Agadir today, it's an amazing city, you know, like, and it's developing in ways that probably the people in the 1960s have never thought about, but it still carries the genes of that moment of disaster, because building in Agadir is very strict, very sturdy, and there is also this conscience or consciousness of the earthquake, and the image of the king and his relationship to Agadir is very, very solid. So it's actually, I would venture to say that it's probably the major project that the monarchy had to face after independence outside politics, just kind of like the reconstruction of a city that was entirely destroyed by the earthquake. When we talk about the 2023 earthquake, I think for me and for a lot of Amazigh people, what we will remember is that it is the moment that gave visibility to Amazigh people. It's a disaster on the one hand, but it was a major opportunity to actually bring attention to the existence of Amazigh people. Like, thousands of articles have been written about Amazigh people, mentioning Amazigh people, mentioning, you know, their heritage, mentioning just the fact that that went out into the world, and that people understand that there is an Amazigh movement, and that there is an Amazigh culture and language and all of that, I think is very significant. And then when you get into the weeds of it, like the details of it, like how it's talked about in the Moroccan television, the later recognition that this is actually a region that has its own specificity. I've watched this Moroccan anthropologist speak on TV. He never said like this area is Amazigh or Berber, but he always said, like, oh, this is an area that has its own specificity. It has its own culture specificity. It has its own agriculture specificity. It has its own historic and demographic makeup that distinguishes it from the rest of Morocco. I thought that that was really important. And I wish that, for example, this person had the courage to just say, this is a Berber or Amazigh area. And it's really important. It wouldn't have diminished anything. So I think for me, the takeaway from 2023 is that it's the moment that the world discovered Amazigh. I wish they had discovered them in a more jovial context, but at least I think the culture, the language, the politics were all out there for people to learn more.
This is a very important and opportune note on which to end on. This has been a very generative and thoughtful discussion. If I can briefly chart, we've examined the questions we posed across various spheres, including natural, political, economic, ecological, cultural, and material areas, also considering indigeneities and colonialisms across domestic, geographical, and transnational domains, while tracing historical and current trajectories. I want to thank all the speakers once more. I want to thank the MENA program, and thank you to our audience as well.
Thank you. Have a good one.
Thank you
So much, everybody.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.
Thank
Have a
you
good one.
so
Bye-bye.
much, Lydia and Brahim, for these amazing discussion.
Thank you. Have a
Thank you,
nice day.
Mariam.
Bye-bye. Bye.
Bye-bye.